Hi. Thank you for the introduction. I think you've covered everything. I'm just going to give you a very, very brief. I'm sure our story's been in the news. There's been many pictures of us and whatnot. And early in 2013, I went and saw 2 gynecologists and 1 gynecological oncologist, so a surgeon who specializes in cancers of women's reproductive tract, after the birth of our 6th child, for some concerning issues I was having. And they all recommended the same thing. They all said a hysterectomy was the way to go. I had every study that I could have had, MRIs, ultrasounds, biopsies, everything that's currently available. And with their recommendation, I underwent a laparoscopic hysterectomy, taking off what I thought would be a couple of weeks from work. I was working full-time up in Boston. And 8 days later, I got a call that, I'm sorry, we were wrong. It wasn't a benign condition you had. You have what's known as leiomyosarcoma, which is a cancer of the uterus that masquerades as fibroids. And so the treatment of sarcoma, or rather how the approach to sarcoma is surgery and removal with good margins, meaning you cut outside of the cancer, you don't leave any of the cancer behind, because once you disturb sarcomas, they can become very aggressive and spread. So the question that we asked was, did you get it all in one piece? And she said, no, I'm sorry, we morcellated it. And that was the beginning of a very long journal. My husband here has do you have the morcellator video?
Yeah, I'll get to it.
Okay.
You want me
Yeah, you want to show that now? So, as I said, the correct treatment for sarcoma is surgical resection in block, meaning all in one piece. And instead, they used a device that looks like this. Here you can see it shredding and dripping the pieces of tissue, blood, and in my case, sarcoma, throughout my abdomen.
Maybe worthwhile. Maybe I'll process this.
This has, for the past 20 years, been used solely in the field of gynecology to remove masses from women's abdomens. If there is cancer in there, it will drip and spread.
I just want you to note that this device is the Gynecare Morcellator. You can see it says Gynecare on the point of entry in the abdominal cavity. That's a Johnson & Johnson product that was approved through the 510K mechanism and really has been on the market for about 20 years until we started our activity, and Johnson & Johnson has voluntarily withdrawn this product, although there are other companies that are continuing to persist and are keeping this product on the market.
I had to undergo a damage control operation to pick up all of the pieces that they left behind. I was in the hospital for just shy of 2 weeks. I had a blood clot to my lungs. I've had lung surgery, and most recently, last month, back surgery to take a piece of tumor that has grown there. So it's been a long year and a half, I guess. In the interim, though, we went to the hospital and we said, guys, this should not be happening. We had no idea morcellation happened. We didn't realize. We did a quick number crunching and realized that their estimates of this occurring in 1 in 10,000 women was grossly wrong. For someone like me who walked into their OBGYN complaining of the symptoms I have, the incidence of occult, meaning unknown uterine sarcoma, was somewhere in the ballpark of 1 in 200 to 500, most estimates.
So, Hooman, I'd like to begin with a discussion of the Power Morcellator and the FDA's approval of that. Can you tell us when that took place and by what process the Power Morcellator was approved?
Sure, of course. Can everyone hear me? All right. Well, yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me back again, and thank you, Professor Termini, for having me back. This has been what you witnessed there was basically my wife and I in the heat of the battle, trying to convince the FDA and regulators what needs to be done in the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. So, we're a couple years out from this. This video has been viewed probably by several thousand people at this point and had a pretty major impact, I think. This video among among several other in various forms. So thank you for that,
You're welcome.
Professor. So yeah, I think in response to your question, this medical device basically went through the predominant pathway for the approval of the vast majority of medical devices out on the marketplace. The mechanism is called the 510K, and essentially the 510K pathway operates based on an idea of substantial equivalence to a predicate device. So in other words, if a device is proposed, designed, engineered, manufactured by a corporate entity, the claim of substantial equivalence to a prior iteration is basically what gets the device cleared by the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, without any need for any sort of clinical safety testing.
As opposed to the full-blown PMA process that requires demonstration of safety and efficacy, the 510K process being an abbreviated version of that to sort of get devices.
That's right.
approved.
So my understanding, and again, I'm not a legal expert, but my understanding is that up until the 70s, the pre-market approval mechanism was sort of the predominant pathway, and then the 510K was introduced as a loophole to sustain approval for medical devices that were already on the market. Over the course of the past 40 years, this has become the predominant pathway where the vast majority of medical devices are taken through this process. And essentially, it's based on a risk stratification algorithm where, type 1 devices are low-risk devices, type 2 devices are intermediate risk devices, and the type 3 devices are the high-risk devices. And typically, the type 3 devices are the ones that are going through the PMA process where clinical testing is required. So the 510K process is essentially based on sort of a risk assessment on the part of the manufacturer, where the FDA buys that argument, and then based on the idea of a substantial equivalence to a predicate device. In the case of the Morcellator, the substantial equivalence was to a cutting device, so it was a cutting device.
So was there any independent safety testing done of the Power Morcellator prior to it being approved through the 510K process?
So not to the best of my knowledge. I haven't seen any of the documentation that went into the GAO investigation of this, but what we do know is that the first report of this problem was the one that myself and my wife filed in November of 2013 through using the MAUD database. So the FDA confirmed, and the Government Accountability Office confirmed through their investigation that the first report after about 20 years of marketing was from us.
And why do you think that is?
I think that unfortunately there's a culture of laxity on the part of physicians. The physicians who were witnessing these complications were essentially the boots on the ground, the experts, right? And if the experts aren't seeing the problem or aren't thinking the problem's really a problem, then what you get is a lack of reporting. Certainly, a vast number of physicians are not educated enough to know that the MAUD database even exists. I mean, I certainly did not know about it until this happened to us. So I think the FDA and the legal community have a lot of work to do. I think certainly from the perspective of how the law could change behavior, there's a lot of room for educating physicians on reporting requirements, especially in the medical device space. I think the drug space is much more robust. The medical device space is not.
So we saw in the video, and we're hearing from you, that obviously there are significant risks associated with this device. Is this device defective?
So that's a good question. I think when we think about defects in design, you could argue that this device, and I think the manufacturers are arguing that this device is in fact doing what it was intended to do, what it was designed to do. Now that said, you could obviously have a device be designed to do something where the engineering conception is defective. So one could think back in other realms about, I'm not sure how many of you know about the Ford Pinto example from the 70s. The Ford Pinto had a problem where the gas tank was too far back underneath the car and sort of elevated so that when it got rear-ended, it had a tendency to blow up and everyone inside would get incinerated, right? And so this was a design defect. It was clearly the gas tank was doing what it was intended to do. It was located where it was supposed to be located, but clearly, it was causing unreasonable harm. So in that sense, I think we have to distinguish between this idea of a malfunction of a device part, for example, and an engineering defect that remains unmitigated. I would argue that that's a design defect. And so we'll see what the courts argue and decide on that. So we're still in the process of litigating that concept.
You and I have also talked about some new medical devices that have entered the market recently, such as the robotic devices used in cancer surgeries and other gynecological surgeries. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So, I think before I speak to that, I think it would be useful if I sort of provide some context. When my wife and I started to approach this problem, we were very specifically focused on the power morcellator. But I think sort of through the mechanistic dissection of how this kind of disaster could happen, and make no mistake, this is basically the equivalent of a plane crash, right? In the recent days, we've seen these 737s going down. 2 planes have gone down, 346 people dead. But if you actually calculate the mortality risk in a Boeing 737 per passenger mile, the mortality risk is probably 1 in several million, right? In millions, if not tens of millions. So in other words, the planes, from just a statistical perspective, are pretty damn safe. What we're talking about here is a mortality risk from this process on the order of 1 in 200. So it's just log scales higher. The difference being that you don't see the plane crash in the public health space because a couple of people get hurt, in Philadelphia, a couple of people in New York, a couple of people in Los Angeles, right? They're spread apart. You don't see it. And so the press doesn't respond to it adequately. Regulators don't see it. And so the magnitude of the hazard is sort of underground, if you will. So, going back to what Nicole asked me, when we started to mechanistically dissect this, it became clear that what's happened here is we have a standard of care, which was hysterectomy, open hysterectomy, that was quite substantially changed from its original incarnation using a medical device. So you have this 510K process that without any sort of safety testing is inserting devices into into standards of care that are pre-existent and dramatically changing them, right? So a hysterectomy is a hysterectomy, right? When we verbally talk about a hysterectomy, that was a hysterectomy you just witnessed. But it's dramatically different than the prior iteration of that standard. So you have a medical device coming in through the 510K pathway that substantially changes a pre-existing standard of care, and it does so without any sort of non-inferiority testing, right? So in other words, here's your standard of care. You dramatically changed it suddenly, right, because of this device that came in through the 510K pathway, but there's no non-inferiority testing that goes in. Now, this happened again in the case of the Da Vinci robot with the cervical neoplasias. Several months ago, the New England Journal of Medicine published 2 papers demonstrating that outcomes of hysterectomy operations for cervical neoplasia are dramatically worse than non-robotic operations. And again, here we have the Da Vinci robot coming in through the 510K pathway, inserting itself into a standard of care, changing it quite substantially and dramatically, and without any non-inferiority testing. So now 15 years later, literally probably thousands of women dead because of this, and what you're seeing is the whole profession having an oh shit moment, if you will, So we can't sort of be doing it that way. So what I'm proposing again, and I think we've talked about this in previous iterations of this symposium, is that, look, 510K is great in terms of a legal facilitator of innovation and progress. It speeds innovation, it speeds progress. But if it dramatically changes, if it substantially changes this, these existing standards of care, we need to create a situation where non-inferiority testing is being done. So perhaps a potential solution could be reframing the 510K, not to eliminate it from process, but to ask the question of substantial change to a pre-existing standard of care. If a medical device does that, I don't think there's any justification to allow it to be in the marketplace without non-inferiority testing. So I don't know, I think I overspoke, but
I think you answered all my questions.
yeah, sorry.
So you spoke of balancing sort of this advantage and the necessary innovation, that we can't stifle innovation by totally getting rid of the 510K process, but there is some reform to be had there. You and I had also talked about regulatory reform, but we also talked about advocacy, vigilance, and awareness, right? So can you speak to that a little bit as it relates to the medical profession, companies, and the public at large?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the unfortunate realities is that the case of my wife's complication became sort of an instance of patient activism, right? I mean, instead of, we took this information to the corporate entities, both in the hospital as well as with the manufacturers, and the response we got was an extreme of protectionism, both from a legal perspective as well as from just a professional perspective. And ultimately, it turned into a case of activism. Now, ideally, you want to avoid that kind of situation, because you don't want activists and people sort of self-immolating and, tearing the FDA's door down. You want to have a cogent, logical conversation. But unfortunately, you have this utilitarian system which is based on generation of revenue and profit, and people are very slow to change. So, I think the biggest point of activism could come from physicians, because, as I said, they are the ones with the knowledge and the information. So what happened to all those hundreds and thousands of OBGYNs who were witnessing these complications? Why didn't they report? And the answer to that is, well, there's internal institutional politics, there's revenue generation through standards of practice, and there's no legal culture that sort of encourages that. And along those lines, we attempted to introduce a congressional act called the Medical Device Guardians Act, where you would encourage physicians to report medical device adverse events without any fear of litigation, so with a shield against civil litigation. It didn't go anywhere. It just did not gain any traction, unfortunately.
So that's post-market reform.
That's post-market, yeah.
Right? So pre-market reform would be changing the 510K process in a way that accommodates safety testing such that these products don't make it to the market. And then the reporting would be after.
Correct. So I think the reporting element is one thing. I think this was proof of principle. I mean, I think basically what Amy and I managed to carry out was we demonstrated it was proof of principle that reporting could work. Now, it wasn't as simple as that. There was a lot of politics involved. There was a lot of sort of taking baseball bats to people's knees, if you will, involved with that. And it wasn't a free process, so it wasn't just as simple as you enter something in MAUD and it works, right? So that's the reporting part, but then on the front end, I think the question to really ask, the sort of mechanistic defect in 510K, is does the 510K device substantially change the conduct of a standard of care? Now, in the case of the Power Morcellator, clearly this was the case. And if the answer to that question is yes on a 510K application, then what needs to happen is the FDA needs to step in and say, okay, if that's the case, you need to do non-inferiority testing to demonstrate that this is at least equivalent to what pre-exists, the standard that pre-exists this device. So I think that concept, either from a legislative perspective or through the court system somehow needs to be made, right? Now, the other example that you brought up was the example of robotic mastectomy. After we were able to articulate this mechanism, I'm basically on the lookout for any medical device out there that's a 510K device that substantially changes the conduct of the standard. So if I see one, advertised in particular, what I'll do is I'll generate holy hell. And the way that's happened now is I became aware of a medical center in Monmouth County, New Jersey, which was performing robotic mastectomies for breast cancer. Now, as a surgeon, I know that the Da Vinci robot has gone through the 510K process. It's an off-label use. It's on the market through the 510K mechanism. It's being injected into a standard of care, and it quite dramatically changes the conduct of that mastectomy. The physician may be coding mastectomy for the insurance company, but I'll tell you that physician doesn't even scrub for that case. typically, right? He's sitting at a console. The operation is an entirely different operation. So the standard of care has been substantially changed without any non-inferiority testing. So that idea was presented to the press and to the FDA, and the FDA very rapidly, and to their credit, they very rapidly shut it down. They put out a very severe warning. So now the breast surgeons are scuttling to figure out how to, do non-inferiority testing for this operation. And that's the way it should be done, frankly. So, I don't know if that
Yeah, so the question on the 510K of whether it changes the standard of care, but also perhaps maybe does it involve a condition or diagnosis relating to high morbidity, right?
high morbidity, I think, so I think if you're dealing with a device that interfaces with a highly morbid or mortal disease process like cancer or heart disease, it's reasonable to ask that question, should we be more stringent about safety testing, right, through clinical trials? But certainly if any device changes the conduct of a standard of care substantially. So in other words, you have this idea of substantial equivalence, and that's great for innovation, right? Because you don't want to slow down the process of these engineers and technologists generating novel iterations of devices, right? That's a tremendous process, right, in terms of progress and innovation. But at the same time, if any of those devices end up substantially changing a standard of care, you got to raise a red flag. You can't just say, okay, you get a green light until 15 years later when we realize, oh, geez, cervical hysterectomies have like a 20% worse outcome, and each one of these survival curves that you measure 15, 20 years later have individual names attached to them. These are people's mothers and sisters and brothers, so you can't, that separation in outcomes curve should not be measured 15 years later when you've plugged it into this utilitarian system that's just cranking out the things and the operations and basically putting a tax not only on families in our society but also a massive tax on our health insurance investments. Because the cost of those complications is being borne not just by the families that are affected, like my own family. The cost is being borne by our health insurance investments in terms of, paying for the cost of these people's care downstream. So, it's a big problem.
So where does the Power Morcellator stand today?
Well, the Power Morcellator pretty much receded from practice from the vast majority of, large hospitals. Unfortunately, unlike Johnson & Johnson, several smaller manufacturers like Karl Storz and Lena Medical maintained the product on the market, mostly because they felt that this would be an admission of guilt, because there were literally hundreds of these cases coming up, and instead of the manufacturer doing the right thing, they decided to retain the product on the market because, in some way they thought this would adversely affect the outcome of their civil litigation in court. And so there are several manufacturers that maintain this. On the flip side of it is that many gynecologists, especially in private practice, just simply don't believe that this was a problem. That they believe this was sort of a publicity stunt of some sort, or that because the percentage is less than 1%, percent risk is less than 1%, that somehow it's magically not a problem, right? So on those two counts, there in fact are manufacturers that are still distributing this, including Storz and Lena, and private practitioners for the most part who are using it. So, what we were concerned about with the FDA was because they did not outright ban this device, that somewhere down the line, another index case or several index cases would emerge where this has been used despite the warning on the women for whom this was kept on the market. And who was it kept on the market for? It was kept on the market for women who were younger, women who were perhaps a bit obese with body mass indices over 30 and were diabetic. The argument was you can do smaller incision surgery with this thing. If a patient's diabetic, they'll be less prone to wound infections with this thing. And they also made the argument that for uterine-sparing operations, so in other words, if a woman wants to retain her ability to have babies, you somehow need this device, which was a complete red herring. So our argument to the FDA at the time was that certainly somewhere with statistical certainty in the future, you're going to come across that woman or those set of women whose cancers will be spread because you did not ban this device. So
But isn't there a replacement device with a containment system?
that's exactly right. And so that was the amazing thing that happened, was that the FDA said, okay, well, we'll put a mitigation system in place. And so they provided an approval to Olympus for something called a pneumoliner and a PK morcellator. And so that's a mitigated version of this device. So here we are about 5 years later. The FDA has recognized the risk. The FDA has warned against the risk in the vast majority of women. And the FDA has approved an iteration of the device that has a mitigation system in place, right? So the question really is, why are the prior iterations on the market still? Why do we still have Lena Medical and stores remaining in the marketplace where there's actually an iteration of the device that's well mitigated, you know? And that's a question that, you know, all the legal minds in the room should answer for me. I don't think there's any legal justification for it.
Well, and that brings us to your citizens petition to the FDA, where you used the administrative process to file a citizens petition with the FDA with supporting science
Right.
behind why they should take the old morcellator off the market because they have a new one. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Of course. You know, one of the things that we've been attempting to do is convince and reason with FDA regulators. Look, the legal ground is very sort of, you know, clear here, right? You have an unmitigated device that's done harm. You've recognized the harm. You've banned it in the vast majority of women. You've approved a mitigated version of this thing, but you've left those other ones on the market still, and people are using it. So, unfortunately, what I was looking for was the anecdote, which we found in the form of a woman by the name of Erin Harris in Schenectady, New York, whose cancer was spread in 2018 based on the use of a Lena Power Morcellator. So we found the index case. There are going to be other index cases. That's number one. And number two, I wanted to figure out what the precedents were in the FDA. And so, you know, I'm not a legal expert, but after speaking with a few FDA lawyers, it seems that the powdered glove ban is a close analog. Several years ago, the FDA banned the powdered glove, surgical glove, and that's one of the only instances where a device has been banned. That was based on actually a presumption of harm and no data. So I think we could argue that our case is actually a little bit stronger. So what I decided to do was file a citizen petition with the FDA commissioner and give him a legal pathway to act, because it seems like the federal agency doesn't act autonomously too well. So here's the legal pathway for the commissioner's office to act.
And where does that citizens petition, I think you filed it in October of 2018,
That's
and where
right.
does it stand today?
Well, I think the FDA is aware of it now. I think the commissioner's office and the chief counsel's office have been made aware. The case of Ms. Erin Harris is an important one. I hope the press covers it. You might see her case in the press at some point in the near future. And I think, you know, with the index case in place, with the citizen petition in place, and with the legal argument in place, well, you folks are lawyers, so maybe you can help me out.
So questions for Dr. Noorchashm?
I have a couple questions. I'll just disclose to you, I'm a surgeon.
He's a physician.
So, and I'm also a second-year law student.
Nice to meet you.
So, first of all, thank you for coming, and this is valuable information. I'm a general surgeon, not a cardiac surgeon, but I have used this morcellator. But we don't use it intracorporally like that. We use a sac or bag to morcellate the spleen, so that we don't, as you know, you can just toss a little piece of spleen in somebody's momentum and it will grow right back. And so we try not to spread tissue throughout the abdomen. So when I saw this video, I was taken aback. I mean, there's no oncologic basis for this at all. None of the principles are being followed, at least in my opinion. So I guess my question is, why is it every G1 surgeon using the sac?
Well, so I think, I think there are a couple of answers to that, and some of it I think may be technical for this crowd, but I think, you know, the idea of using it for spleens, some people have used it for kidneys also. So my experience throughout my residency was that the idea of morcellating a spleen was frowned on. I did my residency at HUP, and Dr. Rosato always would say that you make an incision to size to get the specimen out. That's not the point. So now that's sort of an old-fashioned concept, but the idea of mincing up any tissue to get it out of a port, I think, for the most part, my sense is, even with respect to spleens, it's a somewhat arcane practice. Certainly using a power morcellator is I think most general surgeons frown on it. It was to the point that when I finished my residency in 2011, I'd really never seen a morcellator or used one. I had an idea of what morcellation was, but I never really morcellated anything to get it out. We just sort of made incisions to size to get it out safely. With respect to the spleen example, I think one of the advantages is that the spleen is not particularly prone to an oncological process such as a sarcoma. And so I think the incidence of cancers in the spleen is going to be astronomically low. And if you're dealing with a lymphoma or something like that, you probably know going in that you have a lymphoma. So the problem with gynecologists was that they were just making an assumption that these tumors are benign. I mean, the idea is that these tumors are potentially malignant and they're treating them like they're benign. So fundamentally, from a gynecological perspective, they're making a cognitive error in practice in their assumption of benignity on the front end, so which is why they even accepted this thing, right? So I don't think any general surgeon in their right mind would accept something like this used on a tumor, or a potentially cancerous tissue. So that's a separate issue, and I've given plenty of feedback to gynecologists and their associations on that quite vocally, and you're welcome to read some of the letters I've written. But I think it fundamentally comes down to a training process defect for gynecologists. With respect to the containment bag, I would say that you need the containment bag to be specifically adapted. Because, these bags all leak and rip, as they're porous. So the pneumoliner is a device that was specifically designed with all kinds of traction parameters and all kinds of porosity parameters. So it was designed specifically for the purpose of tissue containment. So I don't think you can use any old bag to contain the spread of cancer. Bottom line is you need a well-designed mitigation system, which I think the pneumoliner potentially is.
As far as the predicate device, is the predicate the process itself, or is the predicate an actual device where they compare?
It's an actual device, is my understanding.
The morcellator against whatever they were using, towel clamp, or whatever they were using to morcellate before?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think my understanding is that they used it as a cutting device. So the predicate was a cutting device. So what is not asked in the 510K process is this device going to substantially change the conduct of a standard? And as I'm sure you know, doing a mastectomy open, where the surgeon's gloved and gowned, is totally different doing a robotic Da Vinci mastectomy. It's just completely different operations. So.
I've had medical device failures in the operating suite.
Right.
And in fact, not too long ago, I had a stapler. I ended up doing a laparoscopic hold, and I came across a big vessel, a guy with a big cancer, and I went across the vessel with a stapler, and I pulled back the stapler, all the staples just fell apart, and the guy just started bleeding. Of course, I had 30 seconds to open it up and get my hand in there and stop the bleeding. And I actually wrote to Ethicon and told them
Thank you for doing that.
They came back and said everything worked fine.
So
I sent the device, I packaged it up, I sent it off, and they wrote back and said, oh, it all.
So that would be an example of like a malfunction, right? I mean, that's sort of like, so that may or may not be a defect, right? I mean, it's clearly a malfunction, right? It's not like the Ford Pinto's gas tank where it's like, okay, I mean, it could be, it could be that there's some defect in there at a certain rate that's causing this problem, but, I think with the power morcellator, the power morcellator, the uncontained power morcellator has a design defect that literally exposes 100% of the women who are being morcellated to that process, which is contamination of the peritoneal cavity with bits and pieces of tissue, right? I mean, literally 100% of these women who were having these operations were getting their abdomens contaminated with this tissue that's being morcellated, right? So you can cause all kinds of problems, not just cancer, right? That's a design defect. I mean, that's sort of conceptual defect in engineering. So, we'll see what the courts say about that.
So as a physician, you think that's the right thing to do, then you just speak up and talk to who?
Well, to be honest,
Because there's no mechanism that I know in place that itself.
Well, the company has a legal obligation. If you, as a physician, you report a problem to them, they have a legal obligation to go back to the FDA, and I think they take that seriously because the lawyers are involved, right? So I think that's one element that's true. As a physician, I think you're also up against your own, depending on your practice setting, your own hospital. I mean, my experience at the Brigham was absolutely horrific. I mean, I took it to the CMO of the medical center, who was a highly decorated general surgeon, you know, textbook of the American American College of Surgeons, chief editor, you know, all this stuff, right? And he, you know, his left brain and his right brain weren't talking to each other, you know. The chief medical officer part of his brain was not talking to the general surgeon part of his brain, and he just wasn't interested. He was just interested in liability management and keeping my mouth shut because it was a big practice that was going on in the hospital. So, you know, it's a complicated answer.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Sure.
You used the example of the 737, and one of the reasons it's grounded today is this website where pilots could vocalize the issues. Is there no such thing in the medical world?
Well, there's the MAUD database, there's MedWatch, but I don't think it's as robust as the, you know, the airline industry has an advantage because when the plane crashes, everyone sees, right? I mean, it's like, you know, you open the Wall Street Journal every day for the past 2 weeks, they've seen, you know, but really if you look at it, right, and not to diminish the magnitude of the tragedy, but, you know, 346 people have died as a numerator, and the denominator is literally millions of passenger miles on these aircraft, right? So you can argue compared to our realm, that's really, really safe. But yet, look at this. I mean, within 2 days, there was a federal grand jury organized and subpoenas generated, right? Because you see it, right? This 1 in 200 risk here is like log scales higher risk, right? Yet it's like, oh, the FDA just writes a letter of warning and sends it to Carl Storrs. You know, what's striking is that the vast majority of these cases that have been brought against these manufacturers have undergone summary judgments, right, in court, because, you know, the manufacturer either claims learned intermediary or some other bullshit, and basically all these cases get thrown out of court, and a lot of folks are just not willing, a lot of plaintiffs are not willing to ratchet this up, and the lawyers are just sort of extracting the money out of this and dropping it, not litigating it. So not a single one of these cases has been litigated yet. Isn't that astonishing, right, that you have this massive medical device problem, you got, you know, big FDA warnings, you've got loose ends at the FDA, not a single one has been litigated in civil court. And that really, to me, speaks to some degree of complacency on the part of the legal profession and fear on the part of citizens. You know, like, you know, a big corporation dangles a $500,000 settlement in front of someone, they think that's a lot of money, right? You know, average Joe thinks that $500,000 is a lot of money, right? So they dangle it there and they settle and go away, you know? That's the way it works. And so none of this stuff ever comes out in the clear.
Steve Shower.
Yeah, is your claim that was sued at Johnson & Johnson, was it Johnson & Johnson or one of their subsidiaries?
Well, so Johnson & Johnson was the largest manufacturer of the Morcellator, and they withdrew immediately after the FDA hearing. The one that harmed my wife was the Storrs Morcellator, and that's still on the market. That's right. And against the Brigham Women's Hospital in Suffolk County, Massachusetts.
And I noticed that the breast item that's a problem was made by Ethicon. I believe that's another Johnson & Johnson subsidiary. I have some knowledge here about Johnson & Johnson. I think they're helping with sometimes that if you look at their 10Ks, there may be more suits, more casualties from J&J subsidiary products than the casualties from the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Iraq War put together. Thousands and thousands of people have been injured by their products, whether it's Risperdal, whether it's Levitin, antibiotic, whether it's their hip implants, whether it's the vaginal mesh. In fact, there's a jury tomorrow on vaginal mesh case. I think the real problem may also be the failure of the government to be willing to regulate these companies that have such a
I think you're absolutely close. You know, I just, you know, I think one comment to make is these cases, the importance of litigating these cases that the public records created, hopefully, and we can figure out exactly where the failures are. Like, you know, again, one of the remarkable things that's happened in our civil case is that the managing director and CEO of stores, the court actually just recently granted a motion to have her deposed. And as you all probably know, it's extremely unusual for a court to grant a deposition from a CEO. So you can sort of do the calculus in terms of how that came about and what kind of background the judge would see. I have not personally seen any of these documents because they obtained a protective order against me seeing any of their confidential documents. But you know, you can imagine what it takes for a judge to agree to a CEO's deposition in a civil case. Well, so we'll see, you know, the point being that these guys, you know, were aware of this hazard, and you know, based on deductive reasoning, it wasn't that hard to guess that, and they did not bother to report to the FDA. Now the question is, how is the FDA and how are regulators going to react to that, right? I mean, if it does turn out that Dr. Sybil Storrs, the CEO of the company, was aware of this hazard and never bothered to report it to the FDA in their 510K filing, how is the agency going to respond to that? How is the United States federal government going to respond to that in terms of holding these folks accountable? Because when you do the numbers, that's not a trivial number of people dead, you know? So, anyway.
Go ahead.
I was just going to point out, I guess, my view that I think this is sort of multidimensional in terms of the problem. It's a complicated problem. You have
It is.
manufacturers, and clearly that is what you're talking about. But you also have, I think, the surgeons who might be, as you said earlier, might be using these devices in a way that's not appropriate. That's generally
The surgeons are not to be forgiven for this.
Okay.
It's just, there's
There's a third component, and I've seen this firsthand in this area, the local Philadelphia area. You have hospitals that are advertising dementia. And I think that creates brand awareness by to consumers who then go in and say, well, I heard that I can have this procedure done with,
Right.
you know, tiny quarter-inch holes instead
Right.
of a big scar. And does that create another, you know, financial aspect to this whole thing?
It's all financial. I mean, it's all financial. It's just the idea that safe surgery is about the size of the point of surgery is about the size of the incision is a radical corruption that's happened over the past 20 years, and it's really driven by the corporate side. And you know, the surgeons are totally complacent in this, right? I mean, so like the Brigham knew about this problem with the power morcellator for at least 3 years. They knew at very high levels, right? Why didn't they do anything? Well, it's because it's generating a lot of revenue, their length of stay is shorter, they can discharge patients at 5 p.m. It's just a massive, you know, money machine. So it's driven by the corporate side. And, you know, the way I've framed it is this is like ethically unhinged utilitarianism, right? I mean, there's been a time in American history where we've been utilitarian, we've been capitalist, but we've been ethical, right? Now it's like we don't give a damn about what happens to the minority subsets of people who are being harmed unreasonably. Yes, ma'am.
One comment, and I'll have to defend the surgeon. She's a physician. I am a cardiac surgeon, I'm graduate of Widener. But thanks very much for doing this, I think it's very important. But what you saw is a procedure looking for, a instrument looking for a procedure looking to fit patients. And as we used to say, you make a small incision, you settle the bottom side, and it really doesn't matter. But I've had the distinct privilege of calling the FDA, and I had a patient with retrievable filter put in after a hysterectomy. She had bleeding issues afterwards, no surprise. But anyway, she was doing yoga and collapsed. Everyone thought she had pulmonary embolism. EKG was bad. They took her to the cath lab, and one of the very astute emergency room doctors said, "What's that piece of metal that's moving?" And she had dislodged one of the limbs, had broken off, and it perforated her right ventricle. I spoke with somebody at the FDA, and they said, "Well, that's an isolated case." Well, darn, 2 days later, same situation with a different patient, another isolated case. And I said, well, when we look at cases, we first say our experience, second one is case after case. And when the third patient died, when they were trying to retrieve the limb, I made a bigger mistake, and I thought, well, I'm not acutely, unlucky to have 3 patients in a row. But the lack of, we consider changing things. If we see something that harms the patient, I guess we're humble enough to say, we better fix this, or we better do something, like get it off the shelves, tell them not to put it in people, tell them to be aware that somebody comes around. This is a very unusual presentation, but she would have been signed out as a pulmonary embolist after she went into surgery, if she hadn't been taken to the cath lab and hadn't found this. So there are a lot of these that people expect to die. I mean, everyone in this room, I hope, has that expectation, because nobody gets out alive. But you don't have to do it because somebody set off a bomb inside your abdomen, or it was unnecessary, and they should inform you. We're going to make this tiny incision, but it may have really bad long-term consequences. But I think we don't really explain the, we explain the upside, the good side. 1%, chances between slim and none, who wouldn't take that?
Well, and just to speak to exactly what you just commented on is that this is the importance of public health, right? Is that look, the plane crash is visible to all of us, right? The public health problem is not. And so now you have the Center for Device and Radiologic Health, which is pretty lax in its safety profile, pretty lax in enforcement, pretty lax in accountability. And you have, a 510K process that eliminates devices from clinical trials and non-inferiority testing for the most part. And so you really, it's really a masked public health disaster that's operational. It's really just, it's siphoning off resources off our health insurance investments, because every one of this patient you described who went to the cath lab with a perforated RV, that patient, her care probably cost on the order of $500,000, right? Who's paying for that, right? And so, not only do you have that problem, but you also have the problem of, the damage it does to families.
The irony is it was retrievable filter, and as we know, people aren't retrieving these filters. They're staying in.
Yeah, just leaving them in.
Defective filters that are retrievable that nobody gets near to retrieve. And patients don't want to go back for it. I mean, it really is, it becomes a dirty little secret, and unfortunately, and again, be quiet, this isn't, my partner says, it's not my circus, not my monkeys.
Mm-hmm.
But it is our circus, and we truly have to be invested in this, and I think the venture you're on, and the question on is to be really, really lauded.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
So I think we might have, would you like to take one more question, or?
It's up to you, whatever
Okay. How
time-
about
time-
one more
time
question,
allows.
and then we have to move
Sure.
on?
I can guarantee you, having been in malpractice, either working for insurance companies that became a lawyer, did plaintiff's work for more than, I don't want to say how many years. And product liability, every single one of those cases that settled had a confidentiality clause.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that is why no one sees it. It goes away. And for the suffering family, you can understand it. It's no accident that every one of those cases gets settled. They do not want anything making headlines. They do not want any big verdicts for companies. And they do not want any appeals that are making talk on them.
Right.
And they do it every single
Well, the one thing that I think the position that I find myself in right now, and this was based on my wife's wishes towards the end of her life, was we're not going to settle with these folks unless they voluntarily withdraw that product from the market. Now, you look at what that means is that we're using the civil court system to leverage, what the FDA should be doing, right? I mean, if you look at the sort of legal picture of what the FDA is confronted with, it's an unmitigated device in a setting where they've recognized the risk and they have a well-mitigated version of it on the market, right? You have women continuing to be harmed. You have the magnitude of harm being completely sort of delineated, right? And they've left it on the market, and now here's this family, here's this one case. We're basically putting the onus of responsibility of corporate ethics on the company to respond to our leverage from civil court. Meanwhile, the FDA is just sitting there basically doing nothing, right? I mean, so should private citizens and plaintiff lawyers be the ones who are doing the FDA's job? It seems like that's the order of business of the CDRH right now, They just don't recognize how much of harm they're posing.
All right, well, join me in thanking Dr.